So hi, hello mabuhay. This is John Wilmer P. Sarmiento, or should I say Winwin Sarmiento, from the Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in English, Black B. So here I will be discussing Harlem Renaissance and the Beat literary movement. So now let's jump to the next slide. Thank you. So this next slide, the Harlem Renaissance was a period of rich cross-disciplinary artistic and cultural activity among African American between the end of World War I in 1917 and the onset of the Great Depression lead up to World War II on 1930s. So before we start, let's discuss first the word Harlem. So Harlem stands for the place in New York or a place neighbor of New York City, where in 1980s they called this year the Great Migration because African Americans search for a better opportunities in the northern state, and they find the Harlem and they find Harlem of New York and they find Harlem, the neighbor of New York City, home. And while most settled into a slightly improved life, they also brought something that changed this land, and that includes music, literature, arts, theater, and intellectual thought. Now let's slide to the next slide. So artists associated with the movement asserted pride in Black life and identity. So artists of the Harlem Renaissance celebrated Black identity and cultural asserting pride in their heritage, while raising awareness like unfair treatment or racial inequality and discrimination. They also embraced rapidly changing into the modern world, using the arts to express themselves freely. For the first time, this period marked a powerful blend in cultural celebration and social consciousness and creative freedom. So let's discuss the Harlem Renaissance. The origin of Harlem Renaissance was the Great Migration. In the early Manhattan neighborhood of Harlem was meant to be an upper-class white neighborhood in the 1880s, but rapidly overdeveloped led to empty buildings and desperate landlords seeking to fill them. In the early 1990s, a few middle-class Black families from another neighborhood known as Black Bohemia moved to Harlem, and other families followed. Some white residents initially fought to keep African Americans out of this area, but failing, many white eventually fled. So like what I said earlier, that Harlem Renaissance was originated from the Great Migration. When African Americans moved to northern city or northern state, including Harlem, originally Harlem was intended to be an upscale white neighborhood. When few middle-class families like Black Bohemia, Harlem become a hub for Black families. In the early 1900s or the early 1990s, despite initial resistance from white residents, many eventually left. So now, Harlem evolved into a vibrant cultural center for African Americans, which became the stage for the Harlem Renaissance. So here, we will be discussing the Harlem Renaissance poets such as Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and George Douglas Johnson, which they will explore the beauty and pain of Black life of thoughts to define themselves and their community outside of white stereotype. And during the Harlem Renaissance, poets like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and George Douglas Johnson, they used their work to explore both beauty and struggles of Black life in America. And their poetry reflected the complexity of being Black, including joy, resilience, and cultural richness of African Americans, and as well as the painful realities of racism, inequality, such as discrimination. So poetry from Harlem Renaissance reflected as a diversity of forms of subject. Some poets such as Claude McKay used culturally European forms. The sonnet was one melded with the radical message of the Renaissance as If We Must Die. Others including James Weldon, Johns, Langston Hughes brought especially black cultural creation into their work, in, in, infusing their poems with the rhythm of the ragtime, jazz, and blues. So, according to this, poetry from the Harlem Renaissance featured of mixed forms. Some poets like Claude McKay used European forms such as sonnet, and to deliver the radical message, as seen in on his poem "We Must Die." Others like James Weldon, Langston Hughes, incorporated an African American cultural elements like ragtime, jazz, and blues into their poems to capture rhythm and experience of black life in America. This combination of traditional and cultural forms helped express the diversity of complexity of black experience during this era. So now we are in the Beat movement. So the name Beat generation or the Beat movement was introduced by Jack Kerouac, one of the original founders of the group. He was used it as a way of allude to the perception of the group as an underground and anti-conformist. The word beat, Kerouac said, was actually first used by Herbert Hank, and Kerouac appropriated it to mean upbeat. The group also liked the association with music. So now, John Kerouac created the term Beat Generation to describe a group of rebellious and anti-conformist anti-conformist writers and artists. So the word beat, according to this slide rather, which was first used by Herbert Hank, was revised by Kerouac to mean upbeat, indicating a mood of excitement and energy. Like in dance, diba? We have upbeat, which means excitement and energy. The group also enjoyed the association with jazz music, which shaped their imaginative freedom and perspective on life and art. So, in this slide, the literary movement known as the Beat Generation focused on challenging the accepted assumption regarding history, culture, and future by discussing the topics like sex, love, and more darker themes like alienation and pain. The authors of this movement aim to more freely and openly examine the human conditions than they had before. Among the major authors of the Beat Generation were Lucien Carr,
William S. Burroughs,
Jack Kerouac, and Allen Ginsberg, and Herbert Hank. Despite the fact that their work was anti-academic and critical of form, they all gathered around Columbia University in New York City. Considering their rejections and academic convention, and their aims is to break traditional societal expectations in their writings. It seems ironic that they would met in the same place, and this group sought to write authentic style that was unfettered by poetic norm or academic expectations.